Hello, friends. I'm Laverne Friesen, and this is True Emotion Dad, the podcast where we dive deep into real stories, healing journeys, and the powerful lessons we've learned along the way. We explore all aspects of mental health, trauma, healing, and spirituality, but we don't shy away from the darker sides of our experiences. By sharing raw and unfiltered truth, I aim to educate, inspire, and sometimes even offer a cautionary tale. As always, I encourage you to be gentle with yourself as you listen. I discuss my life experiences in this podcast, many of which were traumatic. And in doing so, I hope to articulate the profound lessons I've learned along the way with the desire they will help you. I acknowledge that my experiences may be triggering for some. I'm acutely aware of this. They were traumatizing for me. I am so stoked today. Just before I started recording this podcast, a delivery showed up. And if you're watching this on YouTube or you see a clip on social media, you'll see I am wearing a shirt that says, "Real Men Cry." And that is part of some merch that I'm coming out with to help spread the love and the awareness around healing. And I love this shirt. I'm so stoked I'm wearing it right now. Today, as I'm recording this, it's mid-March. And here, where I live in northern Alberta, we have a covering of fresh snow on the ground. For a couple of days this week, we were under a snowfall warning, which means we get to hold on to winter a bit longer. And as I thought about the last few weeks, where most of the snow had melted, and now we got this heavy snowfall, I pondered how it is similar to life. This snowfall has covered up all the work that the sun has done in melting the snow over the last few weeks and exposing the brown dirt and the dead grass below. Now, we only see the snow, not the brown grass or the dirt. And similarly, how often does this represent our healing journey, where we expose the wounds and then somehow regress and cover it up to make us feel better, to give ourselves relief from the pain of healing, not aware that with just a little bit more work, a little more so-called sun, we could be looking at lush green grass. So don't be discouraged by these so-called setbacks in your journey. Healing is not linear, and you may not see how close you are to the next breakthrough or how far you've come. But know this: you didn't come this far to only come this far. Today, I am discussing an integral part of my healing journey that has made all the difference, and that is forgiveness. It is not what many of us have been raised to believe that it is. And before you turn off this podcast in disgust, listen for a few more minutes to see where I'm headed with it. I also have an incredible story of healing that I will be sharing in this episode. When I reflect on my experience with forgiveness, I am reminded of the quote by Eckhart Tolle in which he says, "Forgiveness is to relinquish your grievance and so to let go of grief. It happens naturally once you realize that your grievance serves no purpose except to strengthen a false sense of self. Forgiveness is to offer no resistance to life, to allow life to live through you. My interpretation on this quote is that to not find forgiveness is to make yourself a victim and stay in victimhood. We all know someone who complains about perceived or real transgressions from the past, often decades earlier. And we all probably are aware of how disliked those individuals are. No one, except attention seekers, intentionally want to be a victim. In that same regard, though, we are never the villain in the stories we tell ourselves, and most of the stories we tell others. So we victimize ourselves unintentionally often. I've also heard many times, and said it myself, that a particular person may not deserve forgiveness. This is often quite accurate. Those who intentionally hurt others out of malice do not deserve forgiveness, nor do they care if they get it. They do, however, do not want to be reminded of their transgressions and will take steps to silence their victims through coercive control. But what if they didn't intentionally hurt you? What if it was all your perception? How we all perceive other people is based on our internal systems, which is often a wounded inner child. What if their wounded child, who had been exposed to a litany of toxic behaviors, said or did something they believed was normal, and that action further wounded your inner child inside the adult body of you today, who then held on to that for years and let it take up space energetically? Seeing that bigger picture, getting that level of understanding on others and yourself, will help you immensely on your healing journey. I can say with certainty from my own experience that when you release that negative energy, you allow cleaner, much lighter energy to take its space. That is healing. You feel better. Something to think about, isn't it? Now, on to my personal experience with forgiveness. As a child, I was often told, you need to forgive and forget. And I don't think you would be surprised to learn that I was told this by the most abusive person in my life. I was constantly informed that forgiveness was mandatory, and so was forgetting. That's false. It's impossible to erase memories from your mind, and forgiving is a choice. It's not mandatory. Abusers and toxic people want their victims to forget their misdeeds. Who would want to be reminded of that? Regardless, even if your mind forgets what happened, your body will never forget and will send signals to show you that something is wrong with illness or disease or anxiousness, nervousness sometimes. And those of us who have experienced a lot of abuse, we often mistake our body's anxious warning system for excitement. A good example of that is butterflies. Butterflies are not good. Our body wants to find and remain in homeostasis. Anything else is a sign. This statement of forgive and forget also proves to me that my mom, who was the most abusive person in my life, was aware of the abuse she was doling out. If she was oblivious, she would have responded differently. And just like other abusers, or should I call a spade and say predators, they all try to ensure the silence of their victims. I've said it before and I'll say it many times in the future. Predators require silence to survive, and I refuse to be silent any longer. This is my story. I believe it's important to forgive, but not for the sake of the abuser. Forgiveness is not about absolving wrongdoing. It's accepting that it happened. You cannot change the past. It's unhealthy, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, to hold on to toxic emotions. And by acknowledging that someone hurt you or something hurtful happened, we can start to process and move on in our life. Finding forgiveness does not involve repeatedly exposing yourself to hurtful people. If a snake bit you, you would not hate that snake, for it is only doing snake things. However, you would likely stop going where the snakes hang out. Likewise, you need to set boundaries to protect yourself from the human snakes in your life. And it doesn't matter who they are, you need to protect yourself. Although it might not seem like it, the ability to understand that toxic people are doing the best with the tools they have will help release the harmful feelings we like to carry about them. And my psychologist really helped me see that when I was unpacking a very toxic relationship. And she asked me, she said, what if you thought about it like this? What if that person is just doing what they need to do to survive in their world? What if they're doing just what they need to do to survive in their world? Puts a different light on it, doesn't it? Doesn't mean you're going to hang out with them, though. Early on in my career, I encountered a first responder who suffered mental anguish after second guessing their actions on an emergency scene, which resulted in a mental health crisis. I determined to make decisions with the best information available to me and then would not second guess my actions if I later discovered more information that would have changed my decision-making process. And as in life, once you gain a higher level of awareness, you make decisions based on your new understanding and awareness. You must not be hard on yourself or for others for actions committed with a lower level of awareness. Some people simply do not know better. Some people are evil, are aware of what they are doing, and will never change, which is something I experienced frequently in past relationships. This understanding of ourselves is a key to self-forgiveness. This concept was foreign to me until in the wake of a relationship breakdown. I was beating myself up for not recognizing unhealthy behavior earlier in the relationship, which would have prevented the heartache I was feeling. A mentor mentioned the concept of self-forgiveness, and I almost immediately recognized my lack in that area. Desiring to explore that topic deeper, I meditated on it and promptly tapped into some deeply hidden emotions. As I released those suppressed emotions in a torrent of tears, something magical occurred. I experienced a calm presence in the room as ancestors who had passed on before arrived to witness my healing session. Two of my all-time favorite souls in my maternal grandmother and paternal grandfather stepped forward to comfort me and to watch, expressing how they had never learned to do this while here on earth. As they watched my tears flow freely down my cheeks, I experienced another enlightening moment. A decades-old memory was unlocked, and I was transported back to a time when I was barely tall enough to walk. My mom was holding a book that I had scribbled in and was screaming repeatedly at me, "You are a bad boy." It was an amazing revelation. No wonder I'd beaten myself up. No wonder I couldn't forgive myself for not meeting the standards others held me to. I had a deep-seated and unconscious belief that I was bad, that I was not worthy. That healing session was profound, to say the least. It was an amazing experience that I'm deeply grateful for, and grateful for my ancestors who showed up to watch and support me. I have been told that to heal future generations or break generational curses and cycles, we must heal our ancestors as well. I'm not confident on how that's done, but I do know this. My experience has been that in many of my most profound healing sessions, my ancestors have shown up to bear witness. They are deeply invested in my progress. And those healing sessions are a handful, if not more, episodes within themselves. I used to beat myself up for my impulsiveness, especially after having a few alcoholic drinks. Yeah, I have some great stories. But I held myself to a higher standard and deemed many of these actions irresponsible. I judged myself for many of these incidents. Then, in my early 30s, I was diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when I learned that impulsivity is a prominent symptom of ADHD, I was able to clear that guilt from my system and forgive myself. It was no wonder. Only one thing could happen when dosing impulsivity and hyperactivity with the lower inhibitive effects of alcohol. And I was able to forgive myself with a higher level of awareness that I had obtained. In my teens, I was filled with rage towards the person who had sexually abused me and to the church for protecting and covering up his actions. I openly expressed this anger to anyone who would listen, and I frequently did donuts in the gravel parking lot of the church, as well as vandalized some other property that was owned by the organization. I held resentment for the community as a whole, not realizing that the church leadership had covered up his crimes to protect themselves. In my early 20s, I realized that living a life filled with rage was exhausting and not who I wanted to be. I resolved to have less anger, which changed my life. I can't remember how I did it other than to just make that decision. And in hindsight, I often wonder if I may have just suppressed my anger. There was a change in my life for the better. Over time, I began to realize that he too was just a product of his environment, and I began to suspect that he had been abused as well. When he died in his early 40s, I felt sadness at a life lost too soon. Years after his death, I discovered that several church leaders had sexually molested him, which explains why they had never exposed him to the membership of the church, because they were scared he was going to expose them. And even though I had forgiven him, I had not dealt with the trauma he had caused. Other people are much harder to forgive, even with the understanding that trauma may have created the monster they showed up as to us. When those who are supposed to nurture and protect us abscond their duties to abandon and abuse, accepting the violence they have perpetrated on us is much harder. As a child, there was no way I could have known that my empathic innocence was stirring up shame and rage within my mom, who then projected that shame onto me. I could only question with innocent wonder why I would receive violent beatings for things my siblings were never punished for. I could only yearn for new toys while asking to play with the new toys of my siblings. I could only repeatedly beg for new clothes while wearing the one pair of pants I had to school for 5 days a week, while my brother cycled through several sets of clothes. My young mind didn't comprehend why I was screamed at constantly and called a liar every time I was blamed for something I had no knowledge of. I suppressed the paralyzing fear I felt while experiencing this violence for many years. Describing the anxiety I experienced and knowing the pain I was about to be dealt is ineffable. In one event, my mom heard through the rumor mill that I had caused mischief at school one day. There had been an instant where the lone offender had been dealt with and sent home. Despite my desperate pleas for her to contact my classmates' parents or the school to confirm that I was not involved, she called me a liar and proceeded to arrange a violent punishment for me. She enlisted the assistance of my dad to whip me into admitting my wrongdoings. I was mechanically restrained between the arms of a chair without room to even squirm and beaten with a belt. The beating continued for what seemed like an eternity, with the occasional break to see if I was ready to admit my wrongdoing. When I refused to admit my indiscretion or perceived indiscretion that I had not been involved with, the beating resumed with fervor. During this violent assault, my mom stood back and watched with her arms crossed, watching smugly in what took me decades to realize was an indication of the sadistic pleasure she was getting. If I need to put that into perspective, most people would have difficulty watching a less violent assault on an adult, much less a child, let alone their own child. As you can imagine, it was extremely difficult to accept, let alone understand the violent childhood I had experienced. Over the years, I've had a lot of righteous anger towards her and my dad. Even as an adult, I would experience deep anger and a physiological reaction anytime I would talk about my mom. I had involuntary shudders into my 40s if she touched me. And then I did the work. My mom's abuse continued throughout my adult life through contempts at coercive control, snide remarks that were downright obnoxious, and attempting to hurt me by reminding me of my sexual abuse, an incident that she had never previously acknowledged until I was 35. After that incident, I decided to block my mom on all forms of communication and to not have any contact with her. Me going no contact with my mom highlighted the dysfunction in our family unit. Her flying monkeys came out en masse to encourage me to fall back in line with the family dysfunction. For those of you new to the term, a flying monkey is an abusive person's enabler or agent, often spreading gossip, manipulating, or gaslighting on behalf of the abuser. Some of them know what they are doing, and others are unwitting participants who have been manipulated into believing what the abuser has told them. Others are scared of falling out of favor with the toxic person and will do whatever they can to maintain their positive position, oblivious to the fact that they too have been manipulated. I remember being asked by one such flying monkey why I wouldn't talk to her. And I explained that my mom liked getting attention and she didn't care how or who she hurt in order to get that attention. My answer was sufficient for that person. However, others did not respect my boundaries as easy. I explained to one flying monkey several times that my mother was not my mom, but my abuser. After I relayed several stories of the extreme abuse I had endured, he reluctantly admitted that his experience had not been the same, and he relinquished the issue. As the years passed, I slowly allowed myself to be in my mom's presence, and I reopened the channels of communication. However, even to this day, it is rare for me to respond to any messages of hers, as they are usually representative of a bored and toxic provocateur fishing for attention. One day, while listening to an audiobook on healing, the author described an exercise in which to find forgiveness. He described envisioning someone who had wronged you standing in front of you. Then, he instructed the listener to imagine the hurt and the trauma the perpetrator may have experienced in their lives and how that may have affected them. In acknowledging their humanity, as hard as it might be, it is easier to understand their actions. Then, after acknowledging their own pain and suffering, you forgave them for their abuse. I was driving when I completed this exercise, envisioning my mom and the abusive childhood I knew she had experienced. Although distracted by my obligation to keep the vehicle on the road, I finished the exercise. A few weeks after doing that forgiveness exercise, I was at my parents' house and allowed my mom to hug me, which is something I had avoided at all costs. For the first time in many, many years, my body didn't involuntarily shudder when she touched me. My mom did not then, nor does she today, deserve my forgiveness. She continues to blame her parenting ability on me being a difficult child. I, however, deserved to release my attachment to those horrific memories. We all have the ability to live a happier life, and it would benefit us, our families, and the world as a whole if more of us tapped into that ability. Finding forgiveness for my dad, the biggest enabler and sometimes perpetrator of my mom's sadistic schemes, came much easier. I held anger towards him for many years. But when I started healing my childhood trauma, I began to understand him some more. As a starting point, I reminded myself of the few childhood memories of my dad that showed me he loved me. I began to realize that he was operating with the tools that he had been given, and he hadn't been given many. As I began to learn more about and understand his upbringing, I knew that he was just passing on his own generational trauma. The biggest breakthrough, however, came when I was unpacking a long-term relationship of my own and realized that I had been manipulated extensively and gaslit into oblivion. And by that, I mean gaslit into questioning my sanity and believing things about me that were absolutely false. In understanding that my childhood had conditioned me perfectly to fall victim to an emotional predator, I understood clearly how that could happen to my dad as well. As implausible as it seems, as it forces someone to act outside the laws of nature by abusing their own children, I understood the gradual and insidious decline caused by an evil manipulator. In seeing the humanity in my dad, I was able to release the toxic emotions I had stored in my body over the years, which has benefited me immensely. In a previous episode, I mentioned the letter I wrote to my dad, explaining how horrible my childhood was. My ability to come to him from a place of healing and forgiveness allowed my dad to release his own guilt that he had carried for decades regarding my sexual abuse. When we heal the others around us. As I've grown and healed, I've noticed a change in those closest to me, and I've noticed healing within some of my family members. I am reminded of the time immediately after my marriage ended where I began meditation in earnest and stumbled on my psychic abilities when a deceased grandfather visited me in spirit and, among other things, informed me to go forth and show them the light. At that time, I was clueless as to what he meant, even though I believed I was destined for a higher purpose. Over the years, I've come to realize that it was a loving message of hope and love to embark on a journey of self-discovery and healing, which I did. In healing my wounds, the light enters and shines around me, illuminating the darkness for others. Healing is by far the greatest gift we can ever give ourselves, the people around us, and the world at large. Along my journey of healing and eventually spirituality, I encountered a spiritual belief that explains some of the violence that humanity perpetrates on each other, and it resonated deeply with me. That belief is that in the spirit realm, two souls will contract that one will hurt the other badly, so the other soul or the victim will obtain the gift of forgiveness. The caveat to this is the victim, in the pain of the act, must not forget the true soul of the perpetrator, and all souls are divine. This theory has been compelling in recognizing the divinity in those who have hurt me, which opens the door in allowing me to release the toxic emotions that I may be holding on to. When discussing forgiveness, I acknowledge the difficulty in reaching the same conclusions I have. It wasn't many years ago that upon hearing this podcast episode, I may have replied with misgivings. More like, that's fucking bullshit. If it were not for the powerful healing properties of forgiveness, I would not be the advocate I am for forgiving. Many of the people I have forgiven do not deserve it. But I, on the other hand, I am worth the peace of mind that comes with it. And so do you. You deserve it. And you don't have to tell the other person that you forgave them.
So initially, what you had heard so far in this podcast was the podcast. But then something interesting happened to me. Since I've been speaking out publicly, and since I've started this podcast, people have been reaching out to me. And some are sharing their stories, some are giving me insight into a lot of the abuse that happened in the community where I grew up. And some are just saying thanks for talking. But a man reached out to me since I recorded the part of the episode that you've listened to already today. A man reached out to me and we met up for coffee. And this man grew up in the same community as I had, but he's at least 15 years older than me. I didn't ask his age. And so I never really knew him growing up. I had heard his name. I encountered him a few times. And he shared a story with me that kind of shook me to my bones. But yet I wasn't surprised to hear it. And what he said was that when he was growing up, there was a large group of people his age that, and I quote, hated my parents. And I asked him why. And he said, because your mom would beat her babies in church for making noise. He went on to clarify that by babies, he meant less than 1 year old. I didn't bother asking him if he remembered how many of her children received that treatment, but it resonated with who I knew or I know my mom to be. Through my journey of healing and forgiveness, I've mentioned the memory I unlocked from when I was a little child. I've come to accept that I received a lot of abuse that I don't remember. A lot of abuse where I dissociated, and so I don't have those memories. I've always suspected or known that there was a lot of abuse before I can remember, that pre-verbal age in my life. So him telling me that story validated it, and I felt sorry for that innocent babies that received that treatment. It's not even surprising to me. And this is what he said. No one said anything. The rest of the community just tolerated it. I'm in a chat with a number of people that grew up in that same church system, that same religious organization. I don't like calling it a church. They've reminded me of how they used to preach and they used to talk about breaking the child's spirit. I remember witnessing a lot of that, where parents would hold their child and squeeze them tight so they couldn't move until they broke their spirit. And I know that that happened to me, I just don't remember it. But they didn't break my spirit. It may have taken me over 40 years, but I'm here now. I'm talking, and I know who I am. But this conversation I had over the weekend made me realize something. There's another level of forgiveness that I need to go to. Because this information, although it hasn't surprised me, has kind of rattled me. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of rattled me a little bit. And knowing that no one had my back. Not only were the people in my life who were supposed to nurture me abandoning me, but no one else in this so-called community of people had my back as a baby. And so all that anger I felt in my teenage years and all the anger that has surfaced over the years, it's all justified. Although I didn't necessarily consciously know where it was coming from, my body knew. And that anger is justified because it's telling you that this is not right, that something is wrong, and to pay attention. Don't ever let anyone stay in your life if they invalidate your emotions. And we're going to talk about that in later podcasts because there are so many red flags that I've ignored over my life. And I, I wrote a book literally on red flags. And we're going to talk about that. But every emotion is valid. And don't ever let anyone get away with telling you that you're too sensitive, or you overthink, or you're offended, or you're bitter. I heard that so much when I was growing up, that you're offended, you're bitter. Well, hell yes, I am, or I was. I was offended because something bad happened to me. Many egregious events happened to me. And now, even after a rant like that, I get to forgive and accept that that happened and process it and work through it. But for now, now I'm a little bit angry for that little child and for my siblings who I know experienced it probably just as bad, if not worse than me. So in real time, listening to my podcast, you get to see me working through my shit. My goal is to help people understand themselves, their circumstances, and begin to heal. That's why I speak up. That's why I'm doing this. It's very cathartic for me. My little rant about how my anger was justified has been cathartic and healing for me. It's therapeutic. So grab a mic and start talking, people. I suspect I'm going to be journaling on this as well and releasing and tapping into some of those emotions. After I found out this news, I texted a couple of my siblings about it, and one of them mentioned, he said, maybe that's why nobody is really too concerned about our mom being in the hospital right now. And that's a whole other story, attention seeking, whatever it might be. But her whole life, she's gone to the hospital and nothing's ever been wrong. And that's an episode unto itself. But my dad were in the hospital, there'd be a lot of people asking about him. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, I wanted to share a real-time issue that I'm trying to accept happened. I'm going to accept that it happened. And I'm going to work through the emotions because I deserve that. I deserve to be happy. I deserve to be joyful all the time, or as much as possible, right? I always feel my emotions, and so sometimes we have less joyful emotions that we feel. But when I get to look at my kids and I know that they are never going to experience the level of trauma and violence and abandonment and betrayal that I did. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. How could I not be grateful for that? I am not passing on my generational trauma. I am making a stand. And I am saying enough of this. It hurt me. It messed me up for so many years. And I refuse to let this mess up anybody else any longer. It's gone too far. I encourage you to do the same. Do whatever it takes to stop that trauma that you experienced from going any further. I love you all.
To help with forgiveness for yourself and for others, I recommend reciting the Hopinopono prayer while looking in the mirror or during meditation. This prayer comes from a traditional Hawaiian practice of reconciliation and forgiveness. And it is: I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. From experience, when said meaningfully, especially regarding self-forgiveness, this is an incredibly powerful prayer. I want to end this episode with a quote from the famous Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. Letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. If, in our heart, we still cling to anything, anger, anxiety, or possessions, we cannot be free. Wise words from a wise person. And my own experience has been to confirm his words. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on this crazy ride we call life. It's an amazing ride. I will see you on the next one. Much love. Laverne.